I have been carrying something I swore to God and to the Bureau and to myself that I would never speak aloud. Not to my ex-wife, not to my daughter, who stopped returning my calls sometime around 2019 and probably thinks I am already dead. Not to the 2 agents I worked with who are still alive, both of whom I suspect have made the same private calculations I have, that silence is the only rational strategy when what you know cannot be explained by anything in the world that people are willing to accept. I kept it because speaking it would have cost me everything I had left: my pension, my reputation, possibly my freedom. And speaking it now on a YouTube channel, of all places, narrated by a man who still does not fully understand why his granddaughter had to explain to him 3 separate times what a thumbnail is, well, I suppose that tells you something about where I have arrived. The end of the road has a way of clarifying things. You stop worrying about what people will think of you when the number of years you have left fits comfortably in the single digits. So, here it is. What I held, what it said, and what it told me about 47 people who disappeared from national forests across the American interior between 1987 and 1994, cases that are still listed as unsolved, cases that families have mourned without closure for 3 decades. What I know about those cases will follow me into the ground unless I say it now, and I am saying it now. Before I go any further, I want to say something to whoever runs the mechanics of this platform, the algorithm, the YouTube police, whoever decides what gets seen and what gets buried. I am a 71-year-old man who spent 26 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I still cannot figure out how to get the little notification bell to stop sending me emails about channels that sell freeze-dried food. I am doing my best here. My granddaughter set this up. She thinks this is a podcast. I did not correct her. If this gets seen by the people it needs to reach, that is enough. If it disappears into the digital wilderness, then I suppose that is fitting. This story has spent most of its life disappearing into wildernesses of one kind or another. My name is Dale Kowalski. I spent 8 years as a field agent out of the Salt Lake City field office, then another 18 in a specialized unit that the Bureau has never formally acknowledged in any public document. We were called, internally, the Environmental Incident Response Team. That name tells you almost nothing, which was intentional. What we actually did was respond to reports from park rangers, state wildlife officers, county sheriffs, and occasionally military installations that involved what the Bureau classified under the internal designation NHE, non-human entity. I want to be precise about that term because people who hear it for the first time tend to fill it with science fiction. NHE did not mean extraterrestrial. It did not mean supernatural. It was a bureaucratic catch-all for biological incidents that did not fit within the known parameters of North American wildlife documentation. In 26 years, most of what landed on our desks turned out to be misidentification, bear attacks reported as something else, mountain lion encounters filtered through fear into something larger, occasionally hoax material designed to waste our time. Most of it. Not all of it. I want that distinction to live in your mind from this moment forward. Most of it. Not all of it. The incident I am describing began in October of 1992. I was 39 years old at the time, 14 years into my career, and I had been assigned as lead agent on what was internally logged as Case File NHE 1992-41. The file originated from a report submitted by a Forest Service ranger named Carol Britton, stationed out of the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest in northeastern Utah. Ranger Britton had 22 years of field experience at the time of the report. She was not, by any measure, someone given to exaggeration or fantasy. I want you to understand that. The woman who filed the initial report had spent more than 2 decades in the field. had encountered every species of large North American predator, and had submitted exactly 0 extraordinary wildlife reports in her prior career. When she called the regional liaison and said, in her own words, "I have something in the trees north of the Mirror Lake Highway that is not a bear and not an elk and not anything I have a name for," the liaison did not dismiss her. He escalated it. It came to us within 48 hours. The ranger's report described something she had observed over a 6-day period from an elevated monitoring post approximately 2 miles north of Route 150. She described, in her written account, a bipedal figure moving through the tree line at irregular hours, primarily between 2 and 5 in the morning, at an estimated height she placed between 7 and 9 feet. She described the movement as fluid and deliberate, not the stumbling gait of a bear attempting upright locomotion, which experienced rangers can identify immediately. She described a torso that was proportionally longer than a human torso, shoulders that she characterized as, and I am quoting from her report, wider than any doorframe I have ever walked through. She noted the coloration as dark reddish-brown. She noted, and this is the part that caused the regional liaison to escalate rather than archive, that on the final morning of her observation, the figure stopped at the edge of the tree line and turned its head in the direction of her monitoring post. At a distance, she estimated at 300 yards, and it did not move again for 45 minutes. It simply stood there, watching. And then it was gone. I drove up to the Uinta with my partner at the time, an agent named Frank Rescher, who is deceased now, heart attack in 2011, and I want to name him here because he deserves to be named. Frank was from Michigan, a big man, former Army Ranger, exactly the kind of partner you want when you are walking into something you do not have a framework for. We arrived on the morning of October 14th, 1992. The temperature was 31 degrees Fahrenheit at 0700. There was approximately 4 inches of early snow on the ground above the 9,000-foot elevation line. I mention these details not because they are dramatic, but because they are what I remember most clearly. The cold, the particular pewter color of the sky, the way the snow muffled sound so completely that the forest felt pressurized, like standing inside something sealed. I remember thinking that the silence felt wrong. Not peaceful, deliberate. I have spent time in many forests. I have been in terrain where the wildlife goes quiet because of a predator nearby. This was different. This was a silence that felt like it was being maintained. That is the only way I know to describe it. We met Ranger Britton at the monitoring post at 08:30. She was professional and controlled in her manner, and she had the look of someone who has decided to stop apologizing for what they saw. I recognized that look. I had worn it myself earlier in my career, before I stopped needing it. She walked us through the 6 days of observations with the methodical precision of someone who had been a field professional long enough to know that documentation is the only armor you have when the thing you are reporting sounds insane. She showed us her sketches, hand-drawn, dated, annotated with times and weather conditions. Frank and I looked at each other once during that briefing. Just once. We had both seen enough in our years with the unit to know when a report had the texture of truth rather than the texture of attention-seeking. This had the texture of truth. It had the texture of something that had frightened a very competent woman in a way she was still processing a week later. We spent that first day establishing a perimeter and reviewing the tracks. I want to talk about the tracks because they are the first piece of physical evidence in this story, and I need you to understand what I mean when I say that the moment I crouched down beside the first clear impression in the snow north of the monitoring post, something shifted in me that has never fully shifted back. The track measured, and I measured it myself with a field ruler, 3 separate times, 17.5 inches in length. The stride pattern indicated bipedal locomotion. The depth of impression in 4 inches of snow over frozen ground suggested a body weight that Frank estimated at between 600 and 800 pounds. The toe configuration was 5-toed, but the proportions were wrong for any known primate. The heel strike was deep and angled in a way that suggested a heel anatomy different from human, longer, wider, with a heel-to-ball ratio that I later had analyzed by a physical anthropologist at the University of Utah, who agreed, under conditions of strict anonymity, that it did not correspond to any cataloged bipedal species. There were 37 of these tracks. They led north-northeast into a section of forest that topographic maps showed as essentially uninterrupted wilderness for the next 11 miles. We followed them for 3 miles before we heard it. I want to be careful here because I have spent 3 decades trying to find the right words for this sound, and I have never fully succeeded. It was low, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears, the way a large engine idling nearby vibrates through your sternum. But underneath the low register there was something else. A higher frequency that was almost phonemic, almost structured, like a voice that had learned the concept of language from a very long distance. Frank stopped walking. I stopped walking. We stood in the snow, and we listened to that sound, and neither of us said a single word for what I later estimated at 3 full minutes. Then Frank looked at me and said quietly, "Dale, what do you want to do?" And I said, equally quietly, "I want to set up camp and come back tomorrow." And that was the decision. That was the moment from which everything that followed became inevitable. Looking back, I can see that clearly. Looking back, I have replayed that moment in the snow more times than I can count, asking myself whether a different answer would have changed anything. I have never been able to say with confidence that it would. We came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th morning, October 18th, 1992, at 0614 hours, in a shallow ravine approximately 4.3 miles north of the Mirror Lake Highway monitoring post, we found what Ranger Britton had been observing from her post. Or rather, and I need to be precise about this, it found us. I heard the snow compress behind me and I turned and it was simply there. Standing at the edge of the ravine, not 30 feet away, in the gray, pre-dawn light that filtered through the canopy. And everything I had prepared myself to think, everything I had constructed in my mind as a framework for this moment, dissolved completely and instantly, and what replaced it was something I had not felt since the first firefight of my career. Not fear exactly. Fear has an intellectual component. You can manage fear. You can move through it with training. What I felt was older than fear. It was the sensation of being prey, of understanding, at a cellular level, that you are not at the top of this particular hierarchy. I had my weapon drawn before I consciously decided to draw it. Frank had his drawn a half-second behind me, and the thing in the ravine looked at us. Looked at us. I will not soften that verb, and did not move. It was not afraid of the guns. It may not have understood what the guns were, or it understood perfectly, and had decided we were not worth the effort. I have spent 32 years uncertain which of those options is more disturbing. It was injured. That was the first thing that registered after the initial freeze of the encounter. The right leg, and I use that anatomical term deliberately, was damaged. The way it was standing, with its weight distributed heavily to the left, the right knee slightly bent and forward, the foot not fully bearing load, I have seen that exact posture in men who have taken shrapnel in the lower leg. My military service was brief, and it was a long time ago. But certain things you do not forget. Someone or something had hurt this animal, this creature, and it had come to the edge of the ravine and stopped. and whether it stopped because of us or whether it stopped because it could go no further on that leg, I cannot tell you with certainty even now. What I can tell you is what Frank said, standing beside me in the snow with his weapon raised. And what Frank said was, "Dale, we cannot leave it here." And I knew he was right. I knew it the way you know things that your training has nothing to say about, purely and immediately, and with the understanding that the knowing was going to cost us both something significant. It took us most of that day. I will not pretend that the containment was clean or professional, or that it resembled anything in the Bureau's field manual for wildlife engagement, because the Bureau's field manual for wildlife engagement was written for circumstances that topped out at black bear. And what we were dealing with was emphatically not that. We used the emergency tranquilizer kit from the field vehicle, the one we carried for exactly this class of NHE incident, with a dosage that Frank calculated based on an estimated weight of 700 pounds. I want to say clearly that we were guessing. We were guessing about the dosage, guessing about the physiology, guessing about the metabolism. Frank had a background in veterinary pharmacology from before his military service, which is why he was on the unit, and he told me afterward that he had essentially split the difference between what you would use for a large grizzly and what he theorized a bipedal primate of this mass might require. The first dart hit the animal, and I notice I keep switching between animal and creature, and I want you to understand that the switching is not imprecision. It reflects a genuine unresolved question I have never been able to settle. The subject went down slowly, not a collapse, a lowering, deliberate, controlled, like someone choosing to sit rather than falling. It took 15 minutes from the first dart to full sedation. Frank said, quietly, that was not consistent with the expected timeline for the dosage administered. I wrote it in the field notes. I wrote everything in the field notes because at that point, I still believed the notes would be reviewed by people who could help me understand what I was looking at. We had a secondary containment vehicle, a modified Forest Service truck with a reinforced rear enclosure, staged 3/4 of a mile from the ravine. Getting the subject from the ravine floor to that vehicle required 6 hours. A hand-drawn improvised sled constructed from materials we had on site, and the assistance of Ranger Britton, who I want to say handled that entire afternoon with a calm professionalism that I found, and still find, remarkable, given what she was handling. We did not speak much during those 6 hours. When you are doing something that you know exists entirely outside the boundaries of any authorized procedure, you tend to conserve language. You focus on the mechanics. You do not let yourself think too far ahead. I measured the subject while it was sedated because I knew this might be my only opportunity for documentation. Length from heel to crown, 8 feet, 2 inches. Estimated weight based on vehicle suspension telemetry after loading, 740 pounds. Chest circumference, 61 inches. The face, and here I have to slow down, because the face is the part that the documentation captures least adequately. The face was not human. I need to say that clearly because some people, when they hear this story, want to make it more comfortable by suggesting something in between, that it was close enough to human to blur the line. It was not. The brow ridge was pronounced, the orbital structure was deep set, the jaw was heavy and wide. But the proportions of the face, the spacing of the eyes, the way the nose sat, the structure of the brow, suggested something that had evolved on a parallel but entirely separate track. Not a cousin. Something more distant than that. Something that had arrived at a superficially similar destination by a completely different route. We transported the subject to a facility I'm going to describe only as a converted storage building on Forest Service property, approximately 40 miles from the containment site. I will not give the specific location, not because I think it matters anymore. The building was repurposed in 1998, and whatever records connected it to NHE 1992-41 were almost certainly destroyed as part of the unit's standard archival protocols, but because there are still people connected to those decisions who are still alive, and I am not in the business of creating problems for people who were, by and large, trying to navigate an impossible situation with the tools they had. I will say that the facility had been used for similar containment purposes twice before in the unit's history, and that the protocols we followed for securing the enclosure were established protocols, not improvised ones. That matters to me. Whatever else happened in those 9 days, I want it on the record that we followed protocol. The subject regained consciousness approximately 14 hours after sedation. Frank and I were in the monitoring room, a converted office space with a two-way mirror that gave us a view into the enclosure. The enclosure itself was a 40 by 40 foot space with concrete block walls, a reinforced steel door, and a ceiling that had been raised during the facility's conversion to accommodate large subjects. I had requested a 12-foot ceiling clearance based on our field measurements, and I was grateful for that decision when the subject stood fully upright inside the space for the first time. At full height, with the overhead fluorescent light making everything stark and shadowless, the subject stood with approximately 10 inches of clearance between the top of its head and the ceiling. Frank wrote in his log, in his characteristic economy of language, "Smaller than I expected from the field. Bigger than I expected from anywhere else." I read that line again at his funeral. I thought it captured something true. The first 3 days were observation only. The subject did not eat. It moved frequently, in deliberate circuits of the enclosure that suggested spatial mapping rather than agitation. It was learning the boundaries. It would stop at each wall and press one hand flat against the concrete, hold that position for 30 to 40 seconds, then continue. Frank said it reminded him of blind navigation. I thought it looked more like ritual. On the second day, it began vocalizing, and I want to describe those vocalizations carefully because they are central to everything that comes later. The sounds were varied. There was the low chest resonant sound I had heard in the forest, which occurred primarily in the early morning hours, and which I came to associate with what I can only call the creature's resting state, a kind of ambient audio signature, like a cat purring. There were higher, sharper sounds that occurred when the food we placed in the enclosure was interfered with, which I came to associate with territorial assertion. And there were sounds, occurring less frequently, usually in the late evening, that occupied a register and a structural complexity that I have never been able to classify without feeling the hair on my forearms rise. They were not random. They had rhythm. They had something that, if I am being direct with you, sounded like grammar. Not words, not language as we would recognize it, but a structural patterning that suggested something was being organized and communicated, rather than simply emitted. I flagged this in my reports. I flagged it repeatedly. No one in the chain above me seemed to know what to do with that observation, which was characteristic of everything about NHE 1992-41. On the fourth day, the subject ate. This matters because it represented the first behavioral indicator of something approaching compliance or accommodation, however tentative. The food was venison, fresh, sourced through a contact Frank had at a local hunting cooperative. I had theorized, based on the subject's physical structure and on its observed behavior in the field, that it was primarily carnivorous. The consumption of the food was not hesitant. It was not exploratory. The subject ate with the focused efficiency of something that was hungry and had decided that whatever this strange enclosed space was, the food inside it was real. I watched through the two-way mirror and I wrote in my log, "Subject eats." Subject is managing this situation more competently than I am. I meant that. I want you to understand that even in those early days, before what happened in the final 3 days of containment, I was aware that I was not the most intelligent entity in that building. By day 5, I had begun entering the enclosure. Not alone, this was a 2-person protocol, always, with Frank at the door, but entering. The leg wound had been treated on day 2 by a wildlife veterinarian we brought in under a confidentiality agreement that I suspect she honored to her grave out of simple self-preservation. The wound was healing. It had been caused by what the vet described as a steel cable or heavy snare, the kind used for large predator trapping, illegal in the state of Utah, the kind that gets used anyway. Someone had set a trap in that forest. The subject had been caught in it and had freed itself. The cable had been sheared, not unhooked. I wrote that observation in the log. I wrote it very carefully, because the missing persons cases that our unit had been cross-referencing for the prior 2 years, 47 people from national forests across Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado between 1987 and 1994, those cases existed in a folder on my desk back in Salt Lake City, and the presence of illegal large predator traps in the Uinta was a data point I was not prepared to dismiss. I am not prepared to dismiss it now. The connection I am about to describe is the part of this story that I have been most afraid to speak aloud. Not the containment, not the creature itself, this part. Because this part involves a claim I cannot prove with the documentation available to me. The documentation was archived in a system I no longer have access to, and if it still exists, it exists behind walls I do not have the means to breach. What I can give you is what I observed with my own eyes, and what the subject communicated to me on the 6th and 7th and 8th days of the 9-day containment. I want to be clear about the word communicated before I continue. I am not a credulous man. I spent 26 years with the Bureau precisely because I have a high threshold for accepting claims that cannot be substantiated. What I'm about to describe passed that threshold for me. Draw your own conclusions. I can only give you what I saw and heard. On the morning of day 6, I entered the enclosure alone. I violated the 2-person protocol. Frank knew I was going in and he was at the door, and the door was not fully closed. But I went in without a partner beside me, which was a violation, and I want to own that clearly. I went in because I had spent 5 days watching this creature through a piece of glass, and I had arrived at a conclusion that I could not have defended to my supervisors, but that I trusted the way I trusted old injuries that predict weather, intuitively, physically, in a way that bypassed the rational mind and went straight to the older parts. The conclusion was this: the subject was trying to communicate something specific, and the glass between us was preventing it. Not because the subject cared about the glass. Because I did, because the glass was allowing me to stay inside my role as observer, and the subject, I believed, needed me to step out of that role. I cannot tell you what that belief was based on. 32 years later, I still cannot fully account for it. What I can tell you is that when I stepped into the enclosure and let the door close behind me to its near-shut position, the subject turned toward me from the far wall where it had been in its morning circuit, and it was still, the way an animal is still when it has made a decision. Not frozen, decided. I stood 12 feet from it in that concrete room, and I said, because I did not know what else to say, I am not here to hurt you. I know that does not mean anything, but I am not. The subject regarded me for what felt like a very long time but was probably 30 seconds, and then it did something I was not prepared for. It lowered itself to the floor, not in the way it had lowered during sedation, that slow controlled descent. This was different. This was deliberate and symbolic in a way that I recognized, with that same older-than-rational part of my brain, as capitulation, as an offering of trust. It sat on the floor of the enclosure with its injured leg extended, and it looked at me, and the sound it made, the low, resonant sound, shifted register in a way that I had not heard before in 5 days of observation. It quieted. It did not stop. It became, and I have no better word, gentle. Over the following 2 days, I spent a combined 11 hours in that enclosure. Frank was at the door every minute of every session. We did not tell anyone above us in the chain what was happening during those sessions because there was no protocol for what was happening, and the absence of a protocol meant the absence of protection. And Frank and I had both been around long enough to know that the absence of protection in the Bureau is the most dangerous condition there is. What I am going to tell you next is what I communicated to the Bureau's internal review in 1994, when case file NHE 1992-41 was formally closed, and what I communicated to that review was a fraction of what I am telling you now. The fraction I communicated was selected to be the most defensible, the most documentable, the most survivable for my career. What I am telling you now is the rest. The subject had knowledge of human activity in the forests. I am going to use that sentence and let it sit before I continue, because I want you to understand exactly what I mean by it. Over those 2 days of sessions, using the vocalizations that we had begun, Frank and I, to tentatively map as a communicative system, and using a combination of gesture and drawn diagrams that I brought into the enclosure on day 7, the subject demonstrated awareness of specific areas of human activity. It indicated, through a combination of directed gesture and vocalization patterns that Frank and I had been logging and cross-referencing against the unit's existing NHE vocalization database, it indicated areas. Specific areas. Areas that corresponded, when I returned to Salt Lake City and overlaid the session logs against the missing persons case files, to the last known locations of 11 of the 47 people who had disappeared from those forests. 11. I want to say that number slowly. 11 of the 47. Not in a general region, in specific locations, indicated with a spatial precision that, in a human witness, we would have called testimony. I've asked myself for 32 years what the correct interpretation of that correspondence is. I have never arrived at a single answer. There are multiple possible interpretations, and I want to lay them out honestly, because I believe the people who have followed these missing cases for 30 years deserve that honesty, rather than a sensationalized version of what I observed. The first interpretation is that the subject was aware of the disappearances, because it or others like it were responsible for them. That the missing people encountered these creatures in the wilderness, and the encounters were fatal. I will not pretend I never considered this. I considered it from the first day of containment. The second interpretation is that the subject was aware of the disappearances because it was aware of everything that happened in those forests, that it was a witness, not a perpetrator, and that the correspondence between its indicated locations and the last known locations of the missing was an attempt to provide information rather than to confess involvement. The third interpretation, and this is the one I keep returning to, the one that has kept me awake more nights than I can number, is that the disappearances and the presence of illegal large predator traps in those forests are connected, and that what these creatures knew about both was not incidental. That someone was setting traps in those forests, not for predators but for these. I need to stop here and describe what happened on day 8, because what happened on day 8 changed the valence of everything I have described and everything that followed. On the morning of day 8, before I entered the enclosure for the final session, I was reviewing the prior 2 days' session logs in the monitoring room. The subject was in its morning circuit. It paused at the two-way mirror. It paused directly in front of the mirror, and it looked at itself, or at me, since it could not have known the mirror's property, and it was still for approximately 2 minutes, and then it placed its hand flat against the glass. The same gesture it had used on the walls during the first days, the spatial mapping gesture. but on the glass this time, looking directly, apparently directly, at me. I had been sitting at the monitoring room desk, and I stood up and I walked to the glass without making a conscious decision to do so, and I placed my hand against the glass on my side, directly opposite the subject's hand. And the sound it made, the low resonant sound, shifted again, not to the gentle register of the sessions, to something I have never found a word for, something that contained simultaneously the qualities of acknowledgement and grief and finality. Looking back, I wonder if it knew. I wonder if it understood, before I did, that day 9 was the last day. I convinced myself, in those hours, that I was reading too much into animal behavior. That is the lie I told myself most consistently across those 9 days, and I am most ashamed of it now. Day 9 was the last day, because the chain above us finally understood what we had in that building, and made the decision that people in that chain always make when they understand something they cannot explain and cannot contain. The decision is not cruelty, exactly. It is the decision of institutions, which is the decision to make the uncomfortable thing go away in the most expedient way available. I was not in the facility when the decision was executed. I was told to be elsewhere, and I was, because I was a bureau agent and I followed orders, and because some part of me already knew that not being present was the only mercy I was going to be able to extend. Frank was also absent. We were both absent. That was arranged. When I returned to the facility on the morning of the 10th day, the enclosure was empty and clean, and there were 4 men I did not recognize conducting a final sweep of the space with equipment I did not have clearance to identify. I looked at the empty enclosure through the 2-way mirror for a long time. I cannot tell you how long. Long enough that one of the unidentified men came to the monitoring room door and said, not unkindly, "Agent Kowalski, you should head back to the field office." And I did. I headed back to the field office. And I did not speak about any of it to anyone for 32 years. What I spoke about in the 1994 internal review was the broad strokes, the containment, the physical documentation, the observed vocalizations, the possible significance for the open NHE case files. I used passive voice and bureaucratic language, and I said nothing about the 2 days of sessions, nothing about the hand against the glass, nothing about the 11 locations that corresponded to the missing persons cases. The review board thanked me for my professionalism, and the case file was archived at a classification level I was not authorized to access after that meeting. Frank and I had a long conversation in a bar in Salt Lake City the night after the review, and neither of us said anything directly. We talked around the edges of it the way you talk around something that you have agreed, without ever agreeing explicitly to leave alone. When the check came, Frank said, "You know what bothered me most?" And I said, "Tell me." And he said, "It never seemed afraid of us. It seemed patient." I thought about that word for a long time after Frank died, patient. I think he was right. I think whatever those 9 days meant to the subject, the quality it demonstrated most consistently was patience. A very old patience. The patience of something that has been navigating the edges of human civilization for a very long time and has learned that the correct response to our unpredictability is simply to wait. The 47 missing persons cases. I want to come back to them because they are the reason I am doing this. The creature I held in that building is gone. Whatever the Bureau did with the physical documentation is beyond my reach now. The case file will not be declassified in my lifetime. These are facts I have accepted. What I have not accepted, what I cannot accept, sitting here at 71 with the specific clarity that proximity to death provides, is the possibility that the information the subject tried to communicate in those 2 days of sessions has simply ceased to exist, that it went into an archive somewhere and is doing no work for the families of 47 people who disappeared into those forests and never came home. 11 of those 47 cases correspond to locations that a creature who lived in those forests indicated with the spatial specificity of a witness. I cannot prove that in any court. I cannot provide documentation. What I can do is say it, clearly and on record, for whatever record this platform constitutes. Those correspondences existed. Someone with access to the NHE 1992-41 case file, and the missing persons files from the Winta, the Bridger Teton, the Caribou Targhee, and the Shoshone National Forests between 1987 and 1994 would be able to verify them. I know those files exist because I wrote half of them. Whether they still exist in a form accessible to any investigator with the tenacity to pursue them, that I genuinely do not know. There is one more thing. There is always one more thing with stories like this, and I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because this is the part that I most want you to take seriously, rather than dismissing as the embellishment of an old man. On the morning of day 8, the session I described, with the hand against the glass, I entered the enclosure afterward and we sat together, the subject and I, for the last time. And near the end of that session, the subject made a sound that was different from any sound it had produced in 8 days of containment. It was shorter, more contained. It had a quality that I have never adequately described to myself, and have never attempted to describe to anyone else until this moment. It sounded, and I am asking you to hear this with the same reluctance with which I am saying it, because I am a man who spent 26 years being paid to distinguish between what is documented and what is imagined. It sounded like a word, 2 syllables, a vowel-consonant structure that was close enough to phonemic human language that Frank, who was at the door and heard it, wrote in his log without any prompting from me, possible phonemic vocalization, day 8 session, 15:22 hours. Requires review. It required review. It did not receive any. I heard it as, and I want to be precise, because precision is the last form of honesty available to me, I heard it as a name. Not my name, not any name I knew. A name that began with a sound like the syllable al, and ended with something that my ear resolved as ka. Elka. I wrote it that way in my personal notes, not in the official log. I have not spoken that sound in 32 years. I am speaking it now because whatever it meant, whatever it was, a name, a word, a sound that my pattern-seeking human brain assembled into language from something that was never language at all, it deserves to exist somewhere outside my memory before my memory ends. It deserves to be somewhere it can be heard. Whatever those 9 days meant to the creature in that enclosure, whatever patience it had extended to us and whatever information it had tried to provide and whatever was done to it on the morning of the 10th day, the least I can do is say the sound it made and let it travel as far as it can travel. Ielka. That is what I heard. That is what I have carried. I am setting it down now, and whatever comes next, the algorithm, the archive, the silence, I have done what I could with what I was given. That will have to be enough.